Welcome to today's SANS webcast, using packet analysis to identify false positive events. Sponsored by Endace. My name is Mary Langolier of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Jake Williams, SANS Senior Instructor, Michael Morris, Director of Technology Alliances at Endace, and Mark Evans, VP of Marketing at Endace.
Hey, thanks so much, Mary. Really appreciate it. As Mary mentioned, my name is Jake Williams. I obviously work with SANS. That's why we're here today. But also joining me today are Michael Morris and Mark Evans. Michael's the Director of Technology Alliances over at Endace, and Mark is the VP of Marketing at Endace. Mark tells me it is very early, I believe 3 a.m. or something, where he's sitting right now. Mark, Michael, I want to kick it. 3:30. Sorry, 3:30 now. And Michael, I guess first I'll kick it over to you to do a quick intro of yourself, and then we'll hand it off to Mark as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining. I've been in the network monitoring and security space for over 25 years now. So long history with doing network investigations and trying to help people moving forward with solving network and security issues.
And I'm Mark Evans. As Jake said, I'm in distant parts of the world, down in New Zealand, where it is very early in the morning. I've worked in technology for over 30 years as a systems programmer, a CIO, and then moved to the dark side to marketing a few years ago. And I'm in charge of global marketing for Endace.
Rock on. Awesome, guys. So today, and by the way, too, actually, I give the Endace guys a shout out every time we do one of these, but I really do love the approach that we've taken with these. And of course, and I say with these, like as if it's all my choice, it's not. The sponsor obviously gets the sponsor's bringing this to the SANS community. That's how these are all free. I want to mention here that most sponsors are all about like sell a product, obviously, right? Endace is looking to sell products down the road, but it's different. The approach here is different, right? The approach has been, hey, let's go and discuss some actionable, instead of getting out and doing big product demos. We will talk about the product, obviously, but I love the approach of teach folks how to do stuff and go from there. The other part that I'll throw out here is that they've also allowed me to, I say allowed me, but we basically had the ideal to go and release packets associated with these, right? And so there is a 7-zip file up in the link I just dropped into the chat with all of the packets that we're going to be analyzing today. Now, this is not from the full set of intrusion. This webcast actually piggybacks off of 2 earlier webcasts with a lot of the same data. Unfortunately, there's way too much of that data for us to host, but I have down selected it to a set of data we're going to look at today as we talk about false positives and how we can use packet capture to help us eliminate false positives and why. So first, let's start by talking a little bit about this, because false positives have a real monetary cost, right? Every false positive alert that you get costs the organization money to investigate, period. It just does, right? The faster you can get to false positive, the faster you can get to saying this thing is a false positive, right? The less person hours you're putting into this. I do also want to note that I have worked a number of incident response cases where we go in and we find out everything was a false positive, right? And so one of the best examples, I saw Michael smiling there, man. Like, you've been there, done that, you've got this t-shirt, right? One of my favorite cases around this, right, was Grizzly Step. I don't know if anybody remembers that term from, this is the 2016 elections and the Russian interference, NCCIC in the US, the National Cybercrime, I think, Intelligence Center. They're rolled into CISA now. But they reported a bunch of indicators for, basically for Russian hacking activity leading up to the election. Well, some of those indicators were bad, right? And I say bad, I don't mean indications of badness. I mean, they were improperly identified as indicators of badness. There were very famously, there was a Yahoo mail server IP address stuck in the indicators. There were also 2 telemetry servers for Microsoft, right? So when it says, hey, do you want to send information to Microsoft about this crash, right? Those are there as well. So people start seeing these in firewall logs and NetFlow, and immediately they're like, bam, right? And and they're like, oh my gosh, we've been hit by the Russians, and they're triggering incident response. Now, as an incident responder paid by the hour, obviously this was a fantastic event for, no, okay, I don't ever desire to work an incident where there's not really an incident there. It's frustrating for everybody, right? Because the organization, right, that now there's an actual dollar cost you can very, very easily measure as you pay the invoice, right? But I will mention here that the cost of a false positive there, if you accidentally report it as true, it's substantially higher in terms of regulatory notification burdens because you have a big burden of notification. We'll talk more about that in a second. There's a lot of time and effort from stakeholders. There's reputational damage. You said we have an incident, right? A security team morale and ops team as well, right? Michael, Mark, I saw you on mute here. Do you want to chat a little bit about this, or do you have a thought here? Either one. I'm happy to.
You go, Michael.
Well, no, you hit it on the head. The cost of it is off the charts in terms of, and when you look at compliance reporting, right, nowadays with any PII type of data in particular, the cost of that and having to report and potential damage, the fees that they have to pay to do like not Imperium, but the credit response things and all the things you got to pay out for, it can be off the charts. And those aren't even people costs that you mentioned, just, trying to do the research of.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I think the other key point is, while you're futzing around with false positives, what actually are you missing, right? Yeah. That's the key thing. So if you can't identify those and dispense with them quickly, you're likely to be missing the stuff that really matters.
Yeah, I don't think that's such a fantastic point, because I don't think I ever work with a security ops team that says, oh my gosh, like we think we're covering everything. It's basically a reduction of what number of person hours do we have, right? And then basically figuring out where that cut line is for what are we looking at versus what are we not, right? And so absolutely
right.
Yeah. And so, I made the joke of what have you, but the note around Grizzly Step, but the reality is with packet data that becomes trivial to identify as a false positive. If I only have network level data or net flow level data, I can only see that a connection occurred. I can't see what type of, because again, dropping into that connection, you'd be able to see, for instance, right, on the telemetry server or the Yahoo Mail server, right, at a minimum, right, the certificate, right, you'd be able to see that, well, this is a valid certificate from Yahoo. It's a valid, and again, this is data that we just don't have. And so, or you may not have in a lot of environments. It's one of the reasons we need packet data, right? So as we ask a lot is, can you identify a false positive? This is not easy, right? When you have telemetry that suggests exploitation was successful, right? You have a positive signal that says, hey, right, there's something going on here. It demands counter evidence, right? I remember what some folks refer to as the good old days, right, of compliance, where it was like, I don't have any evidence that any data was exfiltrated, therefore no data was exfiltrated. And it's like, whoa, hold on a second, right? Today, realistically, you start talking to your regulators, you start talking to litigators, not a lawyer, not a regulator, no, this is legal advice, ... But you start talking to your regulators and you find out pretty quickly that we have no evidence is not what they're interested in, because that really led itself to, I don't want to say malicious compliance necessarily, but maybe more along the lines of like well, as long as we don't look over there, nothing to see here, right? Don't put the login in place, right? And so, again, we can't do that today. Now, the gold standard for we have some signal, right, traditionally has been a forensic analysis of the impacted system, right? So you have some indication something happened on the system. Are we then going to do that? Are we then going to go do that forensic analysis? And look, in-depth forensic analyses are cost prohibitive. They don't scale, right? The organization may need to take other actions like limiting access to the compromised system. We see that regularly, right? Where folks are like, well, if we don't know, we need to go limit access to this. And of course, that can actually become an availability concern, right? All around a false positive. So the more rapidly that we can get through these, the better. Michael noted something, I believe it was Michael, my apologies here if it was Mark, but two M names, but the regulatory notification burdens, right? The time that you have to report an intrusion after you identify it has decreased substantially. Right. This isn't after you confirm it, right? You have signal, you have an alert, right? You are now under the gun to go and start reporting, right? It's not a matter of, hey, go, it's not like now once you finish the investigation, then because obviously if we could do that, we just drag the investigation out, right? So folks are wise to this. I say folks, regulators and the folks writing these requirements are wise to this. Now, the pendulum has probably swung too far, right? If you work in India at all, you've probably heard that for some financial services organizations, they are now being required to report an intrusion in 6 hours of discovery, right? That is mind-blowingly fast, right? Like I know nothing of meaning that I can report to a regulator in most cases within 6 hours. But the reality is that's where it is today. That's what the requirement states today. Standard reporting times, I don't like to make a lot of predictions. These age like a fine milk, not a fine wine, particularly in the technology space. But I think most reporting times are going to level off between 24 and 72 hours, right? So within 24 to 72 hours of identifying the intrusion, right? Basically, or identifying, getting signal of the intrusion, you're in your mandatory reporting period. And so this becomes a question then of how can you quickly and confidently identify false positive alarms from your different, basically from your different telemetry sources, right? And again, quickly and confidently is key here, because if we don't have this, if we're, and I'll talk in a minute here about the burden of getting it or the cost of getting it wrong, because it is substantial. And so we want to be in a spot where, we've actually, and I regularly talk to folks like almost like a threat modeling exercise, right? With this, where it's, you get this signal, how are you going to either confirm, right, or refute, right, this alarm that we see in our other telemetry, our SEM, for instance, right? And so, again, I'm going to kick it over to Michael. I know you work in the field because Director of Technology Alliances. I know you work in the field with a lot of customers here. What are you seeing in the field around folks thinking about their regulatory notification burdens and those ever shrinking time windows?
Well, one of the challenges I see probably the most is just SOC teams overwhelmed with number of alarms, right? So the sheer volume, they're not even getting to all the alarms they're coming across their systems and their tools. Mm-hmm. So I find it incredibly amazing that they're trying to comply with some of these regulations, and they're not even able to address every alarm. So one of the things we really try and focus on and help them with is to get through alarms quicker, right? To have the evidence in and in association with an alarm they see in whether it be a firewall, whether it be endpoint, whatever it might be, being able to dispense them one way or the other, right? Because the speed of which you can do it is key, because if you can't even get through the alarms, how can you comply one way or the other, right?
I think that's critical. And you mentioned speed here. Are you working with customers that are using Endace and having that packet capture available in any portion of like automation with the SOAR platform, for instance? That's
much more growing need that we're getting asked for. So we do have a number of integrations with some of the leading SOAR platforms, so that whether it be alarms of a certain class or a certain severity, they can automate the archival of the forensics that we've recorded. And so that's becoming key, right? Because they've got to get through these alarms quicker. They've got to find ways to automate it. The most teams, frankly, just don't even have enough engineers. I saw one study, Jake, and you probably know the data better than I do. I think it was a Palo Alto study where the average SOC has, it was several thousand alarms per SOC engineer.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't even know how somebody can get through. I'm trying to think if I could get through 1,000 emails a day, much less alarms, right?
Right. Yeah. I know some MDR services that are, sitting in managed detection and response, for those not familiar with the term, but some MDR services, right, where they tell SOC analysts or your MDR analysts, like, hey, you're going to have 50,000, 100,000 endpoints under. This is not an exaggeration, by the way, right? Like, so 50,000 endpoints under your monitoring, and they're expecting a lot of the automation to take care of it for them. And they're like, great, until I get to that one that I can't immediately dispense with. And they're like, do I have the data available? Because suddenly those, I believe Mark even mentioned it too, right? Like, what are you not doing while you're chasing this particular false positive or true positive there? So yeah, that's a huge issue.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, I think one of the things that we do see is the reporting requirements are driving demand for packet capture. But typically with those people that have got the scars that have been through one of those situations where they're like, okay, we've identified an issue, we've got a report, we've got a deadline, but we still don't know what's going on. So we've got to, in that case, and we've talked about this on previous episodes of this series, they've got a report, but they've got to assume the worst case because they can't prove otherwise. And so people who've been through that scenario, you don't need to persuade them of the value of packets. They know. But there's a lot of people out there who haven't been through that scenario. And, we spend a lot of time evangelizing, as you are doing, why packets are so important. And that can be frustrating. And that's one of the reasons why we feel it's really important to get that message across to the community in general.
Yeah. I'd like to bring up one more point here too, because we just started talking about automation, right? Or I said just started talking. We chat a little bit about automation. And I know we've discussed this previously, but for folks that haven't been with us for any of our previous webcasts, one of the automation use cases that I keep hearing people who haven't been there, done that, got the t-shirt, and kind of kick in, they're like, oh, when I get an alarm, right, or some detection, we'll then have SOAR pick up that alarm and then task packet capture, right, to start, right? So like the on-demand or triggered packet capture. And so folks, if that's your plan, let me stop you right here on the SOAR side, right? Because by the time that alarm gets to SOAR, right, you're catching the tail end of that event, if anything. But there are some other packet capture systems out there that are supposed to really focus on just trigger based, right? So they themselves see something of interest, right, and then begin capturing around that event. Michael, can you talk to us a little bit about why that's suboptimal and where that can cause issues?
Yeah, and there's really two pieces to it. Most triggered capture capabilities, first of all, have very limited capture capabilities. So what they still get is small bits of packets or just a few packets after the fact. And so not having a long enough view, even downstream is problematic. The bigger issue, though, is if you don't know what you're looking for, how can you depend on triggered capture? And let's say you get lucky and get something that might be an indicator and you start capturing, you still missed everything that led up to it. So whether that was, frankly, days or weeks worth of reconnaissance, whether that's lateral movement, whether that's command and control communications, these are all types of things that are going to show up prior to any individual indicator. And so again, I like to equate it to a crime scene, right? You've got to have the fingerprints and the footprints to be able to say where things came and went and what doors were opened, what systems were touched, and having that trail of evidence both before the indicator as well as after, and having a long enough window that you can really connect the dots, right? And that's where I haven't seen any triggered capture system be able to, pass the muster.
Yeah, that's a fantastic note as well, too, right? We've seen other cases where, not just before, but even after, right? So, the threat actor, we've got trigger capture, and the threat actor is using one command and control versus maybe the C2 or something around an exploit gets caught, but then they're doing some data exfiltration to a different IP address, right? Well, we don't have any of that now. Right. And so that's the kind of stuff, because again, it's not something that you knew to look for in the first place. So yeah, folks, trigger-based packet capture is one of those. And I'm going to agree with Michael here. I am yet to see a system there that has caught everything that I need to do that analysis. There's always something missing. I do want to throw out here, I'll take any packet capture over no packet capture, but right, if you're engineering from day one for success, right, trigger-based packet capture is not the way to go. It always leaves me with investigative holes, right, where folks want me to say, Jake, say this didn't happen, or say this is exactly how it happened. And I'm like, well, I can say that all of your evidence points to that and is consistent with that, right? But I'm missing the data that I need, the full set of data, the before, the after, the, again, sitting on other IP addresses potentially as well, to be able to fully paint that picture. We know the old T-shirt there, right? PCAPR didn't happen. Chuck's probably wearing that for this webinar, right?
Well, and just to add a point to you there, Jake, if the minute you start missing something, right? If you've got a hole in your story, then you've got a hole in your compliance reporting, right? Because you're not 100% sure at that point. So then what do you do, right? Yeah, perfect timing.
I was going to say, Michael, I legitimately couldn't agree more, right? So regulators are rightly skeptical if we thought it was a false positive claim, right? And that's it. The second you have a hole in that story, and I've been there, right? I have, I've gone up against OCR, right? I say gone up against, but have had lots of, we're going to call them very tense meetings, right? With OCR, which is, basically the Office of Civil Rights, HHS, they do, HIPAA violations. I've had a chance to meet with the SEC and the FTC and lots of other regulators, and it is never fun as they go through and they're like, well, do you think that, or do you know that, right? And they know the language, right? They know the competent forensics professionals use weasel words like we assess with moderate confidence that, or whatever those words are, versus the, items of fact, right? Yeah, they know, right? So look, obviously you don't want to ever be in a situation where you are reporting a false positive. You also don't want to be in the opposite situation, right? You don't want to be in a situation where you neglect to report something. By the way, if this ever happens, if you find and again, this is not legal advice, but if you find yourself in this position, right, the best thing you can do, bar none, like 1,000%, is go report, right? Like, even if it's late, go report, take your lashes, right? Say, hey, here's the process failure that led to this, right? Here's how we're fixing it, et cetera. But the reality is, folks, this is leaving something that's purely in CISO territory. And it's really moving up into the area of chief risk officer, territory for an organization, because the regulatory risks around cybersecurity data, are just, again, their first order business impacts to organizations. And I believe down under there's a little mobile phone company, a small mobile phone company that's feeling that over the last week or so here, right? Optus?
Yep, Optus. Yeah, correct.
Optus. Yeah. It's a little tiny company though. They don't serve me. Those who don't know, they're like a very, very, like, obscenely large, in the cell phone space, and have suffered a fairly large breach. So
they have indeed, and can't quantify it properly yet, as far as from the reading I've seen. So don't know quite
they cannot quantify
what's going on there.
Yeah.
Yep.
So side note,
the other point.
Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, I was just going to say the other point about the cost of getting it wrong is, if you can't explain the whole story, how do you know you've remediated it properly? Right. And if an attacker's got in, how do you know you've kicked them out so they're not still in there and they don't come back again later? That's critical too, right?
It is, and I should actually point out here, by the way, that a decent number of incident response engagements that I've worked over the years have been repeat visits, right? Or failed remediations, maybe is a better way to say it. Not that we failed to remediate, right? But they're like, well, we had this incident and we cleaned it up ourselves, and somehow the threat actor got back in. So now we're calling the professionals, and they're like, so how'd they get back in? I'm like, well, we got bad news for you, right? A few hours in, it's like, you never got them out, right? Yeah. And I also recognize that the cost to go rebuild a server, right, is huge, right? Our system admins, realistically, right, the number of them that can rebuild a server versus maintain a server, right, much smaller percentage, and even the ones that can don't do it every day, right? And so anytime we have an incident, there's always this big push around, well, do we have to rebuild it, or can we just clean it, right? Folks, there's no such thing as just cleaning your server. You don't know where the threat actor has been there, but also there's operational reality. And this is another place where packets come in, because I'm going to kind of throw something out here and note that, as stealthy as the threat actor can be, if they don't have command and control, it doesn't really matter, right? If a tree falls in the forest, if there's malware sitting on the system, but there's no way for the threat actor to control it, I still want the malware there, right? But again, what I'm really looking for here with packets is looking at the C2, right? So this gives me a safety net when we execute that best bad plan of cleaning the systems, right? And that always gives me hives when people say that. But anyway, yes. So let's talk a little bit about HTTP server logs, because our intrusion has been basically focused on a web server. I will mention here that most SOC alerts involving server logs, these really rely on alerting based on rules in your SIEM. Most of the SOCs treat these basically anything with a WAF as a no action. Any alarm there, the idea being the WAF caught it, it blocked it. It's like a port scan, right? It's okay, sure, the firewall blocked your port scan, so who cares, right? Unless you're trying to like get metrics, right? In which case, then we blocked millions of cyber attacks today and otherwise. So I want to walk through a couple of your server log fields, right? And these are what you'll see in a standard Apache or an IIS log, and critically nothing else, right? So I do want to kind of throw this out here and note, where we're going with this as we begin some of this analysis, because this intrusion did indeed happen over HTTP. And so these are all the fields that you're going to get. I'm going to make this more real by moving forward and actually looking at an example here. These two hyphens that you're going to see here, these are usually blank because in the vast majority of cases, the server doesn't have this information. So one of these is the second one's the user ID and the first one's the machine ID. And so again, you just don't have that information being passed across. In some like PKI situations, right, where there's like a certificate in the browser, yeah, all this stuff gets passed across, right? But the vast majority of servers in server log analysis, you're going to see these being blank. Now, in this particular case as well, our referrer is blank, and you see that there with just the hyphen. So there was no referrer being passed across. Referrer being what page were we on last? And then, of course, we've got our timestamp, our IP address. Don't really need to drop into too much of these. I will mention here that as we start looking, we'll look at a couple of post requests. Our GET requests, we can see any parameters passed as part of the URI string. We'll take a look at a couple of examples of that as well. But when we get into post, we don't get any of the post variables. I will also show you that in some of our GET requests, there are very interesting headers that are passed that aren't logged, right? And so this is another place where packet capture is going to still really help across the across the logging space. We do get our HTTP status code. If you're familiar with these at all, 404 is, hey, not found. But the 500 series messages, we are always interested in those because a 500 series message means you did something, the requester did something that broke the server, right? So the server did not know how to respond appropriately. These are always interesting and always something that we want to take a good look at. Now, here as well, we'll see the amount of data returned. Now, I have had to, in several cases, use this as my best bad plan to say, okay, was this successful? And if so, how bad could it possibly have been, right? So let's take, for example, a SQL injection attack where somebody asked Jake, how bad was it, right? Was it successful, right? So we can look at other requests, right, to the same page, and then start looking at the return data size. I tell you this because if you don't have packet capture, this becomes your best bad plan, is to go through your logs, look at normal response sizes, and then look at the response size with the SQL injection attack, one that can give you an idea of success or failure, right? The status code doesn't always tell you for sure that an attack was successful, only the server successfully returned the page, right? The requested page. And so, but again, they may have ignored some of the data there. But we may be able to look at the return data size and say, wow, it's an order of magnitude larger than what we typically see there. And then subsequently as well, say that because it's so large, now we have a better idea of, A, it was successful, and B, how much data for that matter was returned. Now, in a case where, Mark kind of mentioned here the Optus breach, right? They are struggling to understand how widespread that was, right? There was some data released already, so those victims know that they were impacted. But who else is impacted at this point is I don't believe at this point entirely known. This is another spot where, and I've had to work these cases as well, where we can say, look, we estimate based on the return data that at most, right, there were, let's say, 100 client records accessed, but I don't know which ones. right? And how your regulators deal with that is that's between you and your regulators, right? I have seen cases where the answer is notify everybody, right? Of a possible incident. I've seen other cases where like, well, anywhere in between, right? But of course, the nightmare scenario is notifying everybody when in fact you don't have to, right? So we'll walk through in packet capture how to make this, basically how to make this a little bit more real as we start doing some of this analysis. Now, when we get into this, this now becomes a question of finding the right packets. I'm all about using packet capture to reduce false positives, right? But this only matters if I can get to the packets quickly. I will tell you, if you haven't seen this before, if you haven't tried to filter through gigabytes and gigabytes of Wireshark data, but for packet capture before in Wireshark, it is a slow process. And this is a spot where I'm going to introduce the Endace probe and what we call Endace Vision. And this Endace Vision allows us to go in and filter quickly and make great or very fast first pass, basically first pass cuts, so that we can then load data into Wireshark for deeper analysis, but only the data that we actually care about. And so this is a screenshot of Endace Vision and how we're able to then go load that packet capture data in. And then we can do first pass filtering across this. And we have lots of different, I say we, Endace, I shouldn't take the show away here. Endace has tons of filters, right, that you can apply, including VLAN tags, right? And this is absolutely huge if you're sitting on a trunk line. That's a huge one for me as well. But again, being able to go in and look at basically a first, or being able to make a quick first pass cut is going to rapidly increase the speed of the investigation going forward, right? So I've got a question here. How can we identify source IPs in the packet identifier? I'm not sure how to answer that question specifically there, because I'm not sure exactly what you're asking there. If we're looking at the source IP address, I'll walk you through that in a minute as we get into packets and show you how we can see the source IP there. But otherwise, I will note here that with the basically with Endace Vision, if we know a source IP address of interest, let's say from a log entry that we saw previously, right? We could take this IP address and then say, hey, we are interested because of maybe an alert. Now, this log entry wouldn't generate an alert, but it was intentionally small enough to get on the screen here and very legible. We could take that and then filter that basically by the source IP address, right? Or in this case, because I want to see the response to, right, to determine was it successful or not, I'd actually come in here and I'd ask it for directionless IP, where that IP address was either the source or the destination. I hope that's answered the question for you there. And if not, please feel free to go back or maybe clarify a little bit, and I'll try to get to that. But this allows us to get a good first pass done. And in fact, that's what I've done here to get us a great first pass across a time window. And I'll show you that here in just a second, because time windows are another really great feature here. I will mention here that we knew what basically what the tool, we know that we're looking at an HTTP related or web server intrusion here. That's what we're ultimately trying to eliminate false positives on. So I don't need this feature today. But in a previous webcast, we really use this feature a lot to go filter out the stuff that we knew about, to go find stuff we didn't know about, which in this case was, or in that particular case, was reverse shells on a system. Now, we're going to cover in our next webcast some stuff on zero trust and how we can use some of this application filtering to really prep the landscape for zero trust. So I don't want to deep dive too far into that today. But there are, I don't even know how many applications here. It's hundreds of applications that you can filter on directly if you know that's what you're looking for, and filter those in or filter those out, right? We got a question here in the chat, and I'm going to pass this to Michael, excuse me. I said the UI that we're showing looks very similar to a tool called Moloch. Is there any relation between those two tools, Endace Vision and Moloch?
Short answer, no relation. Moloch is open source application, so it does some similar capabilities. Just much more limited in scale.
Yeah, I kid you not. If you forced me to answer that question, that would have been my guess. Moloch has some NSM filtering capabilities. Want to be super clear here. One of the big capabilities that we have here with basically with Endace Vision is the ability, well, with Endace generally on the probes, is the ability to capture and filter through just massive amounts of packet capture, right? And that's, basically from small scale. I've got a little 1U device all the way up to what's your biggest device that you guys have? Is it?
Yeah. So our largest single appliance is a 4U box that can get over a petabyte of traffic in it.
Okay. Yeah. So we're talking on a completely different scale, and that's not just a petabyte that's sitting there that if you need to access it will take you days to filter through. Again, this is something that you can fire up. By the way, correct me if I'm wrong here, Michael, but this is something you can fire up and say, hey, I need to show me across that petabyte of data. I need to see everything that talked to this IP address right across that petabyte of data, and you can expect search results to come back not in days, but hopefully in minutes, right?
Oh, even less than that. Yeah, we can do
yeah.
we can do search on a single event and get results in under a minute for a specific time range and IP address. So yeah, really high speed search. And one thing to add on that, Jake, too, is it's one thing to do it on a single appliance. We can actually do it across a fabric of multiple appliances. We've separated and we have a federated search capability. So if you've got a global infrastructure, or maybe you have a probe in multiple locations, you're now searching N petabytes of data equally as fast.
Gotcha. So if I had, let's say, I've got a North American office, a European office, and a Southeast Asia office, and we have an Endace probe at all three of those, right? Looking at egress traffic, let's just say north-south traffic, right? Just to pick a straw man. I can do a search, and I'm independently searching across all those appliances simultaneously, and they're returning results. I'm not having to go to each box and search.
Absolutely, and that's part of the power of our platform is just tremendous scale of having a fabric of probes. Again, you had a really simple example of 3, but we've literally got customers with hundreds of probes across global infrastructures, and being able to do that. And as a SOC analyst, you don't want to know where all these probes are at. You just want to know that you're searching your entire network's infrastructure, and you're looking for anybody talking to, as in your example here, that single external IP address.
Yeah, that's fantastic too. And you brought up such a great point here, because I don't want to say SOC analysts is race to the bottom, because it's not. By the way, for SOC analysts, thank you for what you do. But we also know the time pressures you're under, and you don't want to have to think about, did I log into the right box? Did I query? And then the other big thing too, just from an architecture standpoint, that stops me from needing to bring a bunch of packet capture home. Basically trying to bring it back to some centralized location. I can keep that packet capture as close as possible to where it was generated, right, without losing my ability to quickly and accurately, for that matter, get to ground truth on what's in the data, right?
You can even decode it there. We've got Wireshark actually on the probes where the data's captured, so you can be using that. So no need to download PCAPs at all, really. Which is a big security thing too. You don't want people taking what may be data that contains information that you do not want to get around home on their laptops. That's not a good thing. So the ability to control access to that data is important to people too.
Yeah. One other point too, maybe worth mentioning here as well, while we're talking about this, having Wireshark and Bro/Zeek, for that matter, on the probe itself, right, where the analyst basically is going in through like a guacamole session effectively to drive Wireshark on the probe. That actually solves a lot of data locality requirements as well. That a lot of teams are starting to. We were talking about regulatory a minute ago. I can't believe I didn't bring in data locality, because it's such an issue, right? Me downloading that packet capture from a probe in Germany and bringing it home to the United States may well have run afoul of numerous, actually, as it turns out, regulations, both European Union and German specific, right? So. So having the ability to do the analysis there, beyond the time saving, there may also be a regulatory benefit there, right? So and we mentioned already, like being able to select time windows, right? Time windows, basically here again, we can go and filter into a time window and quickly determine either yay or nay, there was or was not communication across any set of filters, right? Here I only have directionless IP set, but I can set any number of filters here as well. We got a question from another audience member here asking about probes. They're asking, are these in the form of network taps or NICs in promiscuous mode? Michael or Mark, when do you want to tackle this?
Yeah, so short answer. So Endace our physical appliances. We do have virtual instances as well, but we are typically being fed off of a network tap or a packet broker. So, whether it's somebody like a Gigamon or a Keysight, where you've got physical taps in your environment already, and then those are typically being fed to a broker in a lot of larger environments, where then you can filter and route specific sets of traffic to specific tools.
Awesome. So we've done all this work, right? So at this point, I want to drop in and take a look at our first interesting example. And I'm going to pull up Wireshark here. I've got some pastables ready to go here, but I do want to note that the reason that we highlighted on this, right, is bash, right? So we've got bin bash, right? We also have the 200 code, right? So 200 meaning success. So the combination of bash in the basically bash in the log entry plus the 200 response code indicating success, right? Now remember, we want to be very clear here. This doesn't mean success in the case of the exploit was successful, although I have worked several incidents where somebody has triggered an incident response retainer and said, hey, come investigate this. We have a successful attack on our infrastructure. And it's like, well, no, but again, being able to dive into this without that information, this looks like it could have been successful. We don't know. Right. Now, if you're looking at this too, by the way, there's other stuff that works a little bit or that might work a little bit to this. You'll notice here that there's a basically that there's a lot of, looks like garbage here, but this actually sits inside the user agent for the user agent, excuse me, sits in the referrer. So the referrer here. But what they're looking for effectively is, will something trigger based on me sending data in the referrer? And the answer here sometimes is yeah. Now, the amount of data returned is not substantial, 2070. But one thing that may alert the SOC a little bit more here, and this may have also been another reason why this was, or several other reasons, why this was triggered here. One is the oastify.com. Right. So if you're not familiar with oastify.com, Oastify is basically a testing site that is used with Burp Suite. Right. So if you've got Burp Suite Pro, you can use this. Now, obviously, this could be a pen tester, but if we've quickly checked and said, well, we don't have an open pen test going, then you have to look and say, well, this is probably a threat actor. One of the big benefits of them using something like Oastify is this is their unique ID, right? And I say unique ID, but unique for this particular engagement. And so this doesn't require the threat actor to build their own infrastructure in order to go test your, basically in order to go test and receive that callback, right? We're going to assume that this is the source IP address is coming through a VPN. That's how they're hiding, how they're getting to you. But if they're trying to test command injection, and that's absolutely what they're doing here, blind command injection, in fact, so they're going to ping, right? And they're pinging to this, and they're doing a -C1. So what I've started with here is I filtered and said, show me everything using Endace Vision from this IP address. And by the way, that upload, or sorry, the packets that I mentioned before in the packets for the webcast today that are in the chat there, that's actually where they came from, is that original dump from Endace Vision off of this IP address. So with that, let's go grab our packets. And the first thing I'm going to do here, by the way, since I now have all the packets from, and I saved it out, cleverly named as the IP address.pcap. By the way, if you are on GitHub, right, there's another packet capture there from previous webcasts we've done, but I'll mention here, this one's too large to go into GitHub without zipping it up. So it's a 7Z, but when you unzip it, it's the packet capture. So the first things I'm going to do here, because I'm going to look at, since I know, I'm just literally going to say, hey, ICMP, right? Did we filter? Did we get any ICMP? And the answer there is, yikes, we did get some ICMP, right? So this obviously is concerning to us, right? Because we do have some ICMP from here. This probably means somewhere, right, that something triggered basically something triggered a command injection someplace, right? And so this, of course, always interesting for us. What I'm going to do here as well, though, is I want to go and see from a time perspective. Right now, I know where in the packet capture this sits, right? So as far as the ping request. And as by the way, too, here you see a timestamp request and timestamp reply. Those are probably, I don't want to say less interesting necessarily, but again, we got a ping request, and we've got a ping reply as well. And so at this point, then we could say, well, okay, we know that there was some attempt to do some, some ICMP. Again, these are probably them scanning the server, right? But I would look back here as well and probably do another pass, having done some more. Again, these are them pinging. We don't necessarily see any outbound, basically any outbound ICMP. But let's go back here as well meaning outbound ICMP from the server generating a request. Let's go here as well and let's go find this, basically find this entry. I'm going to go back here and use my pastable of frame contains, all right? So frame contains bash, because we know that's what we alerted on in the first place, as well as the HTTP request method of get, all right? So I see a get. I could get a little more surgical with this. Let's see how many responses we get. As you can see, this filters pretty quickly. We do get a few interesting entries here. It might be that I do want to indeed say, and frame contains login.php. Right. And at this point, then we're going to be down to just a few entries, right? So at this point, and again, by the way, if you want the packets, again, out on GitHub, you can play along here as well. And this is the point where I can go down and look at my user agent, right? Well, okay, what about my referrer, right? Okay, so I see a referrer there. Hey, that's the one we're looking at here, with the one that says truncated on the referrer side. And so what I'm going to do here, and obviously, again, this individual has hammered this server, right? So it's not a question of did they try to target the server, right? The question is, did they, were they successful in it? Because we're registering this as a possible false positive. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click and I'm going to go down to follow, and you'll notice there's a TCP stream and there's an HTTP stream. The difference here is that with an HTTP stream, we are actually decoding the gzip data. And so typically most of your data that gets sent over HTTP is gzip encoded. And so if we can decode that, why wouldn't we? To be able to go and see the response. Otherwise, it's additional work for you. So we're going to go and follow that HTTP stream. Now, I want to note here that while this wasn't like immediate, right? This relies on that the speed for this to return is directly proportional to the size of your packet capture overall. And so we're starting with about a 28 meg packet capture. This is tolerable. You get up into 100 meg plus packet captures and you're wait. And then as you get into gigabyte plus, right? And I immediately see Michael, like gigabyte plus, right? Then that's where things get to be, call your mom, go make lunch, that kind of stuff, right? And or wait for Wireshark to crash, as it eventually does as you go apply and reapply filters, right? But now we're able to go in and see a bit here, right? I do want to note a few things here, right? These are non-standard HTTP headers that are being sent, right? That are being sent by the, basically by the threat actor, right? So I say threat actor here, tester, threat actor. We're calling it a threat actor at the moment because we don't have an authorized pen test going, all right? And so what we're looking at here effectively, by the way, too, that's a scenario. We did have an authorized pen test going in that, we said, by all means, please go hammer this box, right? But lest somebody goes and tries to pursue whoever this is at Elastify or with Burp. But these are all headers that we don't have in our logs, right? Now, why these matter, as it turns out, is that some of these are used, and the reason that they're here, some of these are used to go bypass WAF. Right. So one of the things that we see here specifically is the X forwarded for. So when you have a load balancer, one of the problems we run into all the time is that our HTTP logs are logging the IP address of the load balancer and not the original requester. And so one of the ways that folks will bypass WAFs is to put an X forwarded for of a 127.0.0.1, for instance, or guess an internal IP address of the server. And sometimes the WAF processes that and looks and says, oh my gosh, okay, well, cool. You're an internal and you got misrouted through the WAF, right? And if you're like, that's really dumb, I get it, right? Except WAFs are making millions of decisions, right? In some cases, more than that a second, depending on the system, right? So these are all headers that may be valuable in our investigation that we don't have any, excuse me, that we don't have any, any other data or any other data in our logs around, right? So here you also note, and it becomes a little bit easier to see, that we can see here there's a question around cmd.exe versus versus bash. It could well be the case that well, again, in this particular case, I don't think, do we have the command.exe? Yeah, we do. So the command.exe is there as well. So we are getting the full user agent there. Or sorry, full referrer string, excuse me, full referrer string. But here again, a little bit easier to see, as well as these additional fields. Now, as we go in here again, by the way, notice the content encoding of gzip, right? So it was going, the server, if we do a follow TCP stream, does indeed show us basically a bunch of gzip data. What I really want to see here, though, is do I have any, do I have anything in the response, right, that might indicate any, any success? And I don't see anything here specifically. Like I said, my other big check that I'm going to do with this, because I filtered here on the 98, I'm going to go back and look at the 98.2.196.234 is I would go back and grab a, just like I did ICMP here before, right? I would also take another filter back in Endace Vision to go and look and say, okay, well, did we finding the IP address of this, basically of this oastify.com endpoint? Do we have any ICMP going out to those, right? That was an easy pass for us. We didn't need to export any PCAP for that. There was just no data returned, right? So we can now safely mark this as a false positive. We see no ICMP outbound. And then separately, let me go grab the, still up here. Separately, when we go look at any returned data here, we don't see anything that's abnormal at all, right? So comparing this to a normal response, this looks to be normal. Check, this is a false positive. I can take that to the bank, stand up in front of a judge, and not worry a bit, right, that we have any issues there, right? I want to walk through another interesting example here. And of course, we've got some slideware here for in case my demos fail, which is, yes. By the way, there's a fantastic site called demogoats.com. Where apparently you can sacrifice a virtual goat before you do any live demos, right? So anyway, but this interesting example here, I do want to highlight, these are post examples, right? So why does post matter so much, right? Well, a couple of reasons. First off, we don't see the variables by design, right? There are variables that are sent that we can't see. So the second reason that we, and I say we can't see in the logs, right? So here specifically, we can see that there's a likely attempt here to set here basically cross-site scripting using, as it turns out, the cross-site scripting using basically the referrer field, all right? I said refer using the user agent field. So here there's JavaScript being placed in here. Same thing again here with the basically this SVG, right? So if you're not familiar with that, that's a scalable vector graphics, right? And so these, as opposed to like a GIF or a JPEG, they basically are instructions for how to build a basically build an image rather than the image itself, right? Well, that of course contains active code, and so threat actors will try to use that to go and do some exploitation, right? So the SOC now has alerted on these two, and again, for good reason, right? We have a 200 response code, and by the way, this is a SOC that is already well tuned because a lot of folks aren't even investigating alarms that look like this because, to Mark's point earlier, they're just underwater, right? They're just underwater. But we don't know yet whether or not this is a true positive or a false positive. And so let's hop over both of these, by the way. Let's hop back to Wireshark, right? And we're going to go grab, if you notice here, this first one starts with an M4RB, whatever. I'm going to go grab that. And we're going to drop in here. And again, I'm doing a little bit of cheating. I say cheating, maybe cheating is the wrong word here. I'm using the cheat code in Wireshark, frame contains, right? If you haven't seen this before, this basically says, go find this somewhere in the basically in the packet capture data. This doesn't always work if you have like gzipped data that this is underneath, but this is a really good start, right? And so we're looking here that returns exactly one entry. And if this is indeed reflected cross-site scripting, we would expect to see that reference or see that at least basically reflected in the response. And so here we're going to go and again follow our HTTP stream. There we go. And so as we follow our HTTP stream, again, we see the requests. We again also see a number of headers that we didn't have before. But I do want to call out here, right, that the username and password, right, and the form equals submit. This is all post data. This is all stuff that by design we are not seeing in our HTTP server logs, right? That can be useful in identifying a false positive or confirming a true positive. And again, we're not going to see this data. If you think about this being like SQL injection data potentially, right, that can be hugely, hugely problematic, right? So anywho, the fact that we're not seeing it, right? And so here we can go through, we can scan through this data again and identify that no, there is no space here where indeed we are basically reflecting anything back to the user as a result of that, or as a result of processing that data. And so one more here, and again, this is from this data here. I'm going to go grab another frame contains, right? And we'll hop back over here and we'll confirm indeed that this also did not create any reflected cross-site scripting. Now, one of the things I'd be remiss not to mention here is that if you're involved in any bug bounty work or have done any bug bounty work, or your organization just receives basically a report from a user for a period of time after somebody says, hey, you got a cross-site scripting problem, every cross-site scripting that gets lit up in the SIEM, immediately like, they're exploiting the vulnerability that was reported, right? I've been there around this. This is a spot where packet capture is so critical. Because again, I can come in here and I can say, hey, let's go in and So this is a neat spot where, let's actually go take a look at this one, right? We're following the TCP stream. We don't have an HTTP stream for whatever reason, right? So Wireshark simply has not, does not recognize this specifically as HTTP and isn't decoding it as a result. But we can then take our gzip data, right? And we can go export objects here. Let's see, export objects from HTTP, and we can go and decode it that way. So having are the filters being used available to follow along the PCAPs? As a matter of fact, they are. So kind of, in the sense that they're in the screenshots. I'll add the filters there, Dylan, and upload those to the GitHub as well. All right. So, but did want to highlight here that after we go through and export our objects, we still don't see any evidence of any reflected cross-site scripting data there. And so again, coming back to this being the basically this giving us the ability to go and again, if we wanted to export objects, it literally is come over here and export HTTP objects. And this is a spot where I'm going to need to go. I say need to. Typically, I'm going to want to go filter against my current stream. But in any case here, right? I do want to highlight, and again, here your packet, if you notice over here, packet filters, right? We can go in and identify packet number. We can go in here and quickly identify which response or request specifically we're looking around for. Here we've walked through an example of going through and eliminating false positives. There are lots more false positives. As a matter of fact, not only upload the filters I'm using here, also upload the Apache log so that you can go through and see some of the stuff that may have triggered some of these, some of these investigations, right? But yeah, so we've got the filters are here on the screenshots. Like I said, I'll throw those in GitHub as soon as we're done with the webcast. So we are running right up to time though. I'm going to wrap up here, but I do want to give Michael and Mark closing thoughts as well. Folks, from where I sit, I just want to note here that investigating false positive alarms is increasingly important for compliance with regulatory frameworks. My discussions with regulators over the last, let's say, 2 years are foundationally different than they were 10 years ago. Right? Foundationally different. It used to be a kind of come in, it was a kumbaya, oh, it's a little cybersecurity event. Man, they are out for blood now. Not all of them, right? But there's a foundationally different standard of evidence that is being requested. Packet captures help me get to full-on ground truth on what caused an alarm. Time's not on your side for identifying these. We talked about the speed, why speed matters so much with these packet analysis platforms, because high volumes of packet capture don't matter if you can't get it in the time required, right? So Michael, Mark, I want to hand it over to you guys. Michael, I'll head it to you first for any closing thoughts as well. But
yeah, that last point you made is key, right? And one of the whole premises of the Endace platform is to have integrations from other security tools you've already got in your environment. So we talked about SOAR earlier, whether it's your SOAR tools, whether it's your SIM, whether it's directly from your firewalls. We've got integrations with most of the leading security tools in the industry, so that in the context of those events, you can drill straight from those tools straight to Endace Vision, like you saw, like you were doing. And then you have the power of Endace Vision to really focus in on the right packet data, right? Because like you said, looking through a 20 megabyte one is very different than working through a 1 gig packet capture. And we've got lots of gigs of packet data. So it's imperative that if you're going to have a platform, you've got to be able to focus and get to the right data quickly. And we want you to do it in the context of the other tools you've already got. So that's really part of the power of the system that we're trying to help users take advantage of.
Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, I think I would. I totally agree with what Michael said. I think the other point to make is packets can be used in so many ways to help with false positives, not just to rule them out individually, but things like tuning firewall rules, right? So that you're removing that flood of unnecessary alerts, so that your analysts are not overwhelmed, and you can use packet data to replay against your rules to test them, to make sure that they filter out the things that you don't want to see, but they don't filter out the things that you do want to see. And that's another really powerful use of packet data.
Outstanding. Well, folks, I see we've got a couple of questions come in. We'll forward these over to the guys at Endace because I've already ran over by a minute or two, and I don't want Mary to be horribly mad at me. With that, I'll just thank Endace for bringing this fantastic content to the SANS community. And Mary, I'm going to hand it back to you to close out our webinar.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Jake, Michael, and Mark, for your great presentation, and to Endace for sponsoring this webcast, which helps to bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.